Our final speaker this evening is Lucy Hunter-Blackburn, who was previously a board member of the Howard League for Penal Reform Scotland. She co-founded MBM Policy with Dr. Kath Murray and Lisa Mackenzie. And MBM is a policy analysis collective, and they're currently very much focused on how sex and gender identity issues are approached in policy making in Scotland. I have to say, here in Scotland, we couldn't have done the campaigning that we have done over the last few years if it hadn't been for our Brains Trust MBM. So I would now invite Lucy to address the relationship between gender recognition reform and the Equality Act, amongst other things.
Right. So thank you so very much for asking me to join this panel. My background is in making and analysing policy, and though I was an active trade union member and will be happy to hear across my formal career, I can't claim to have the experience of tonight's other speakers in frontline activism. I can say, though, like many women, in my time, I have had need to draw on the protections that have been put in place against sex discrimination at work, and I know firsthand, therefore, how valuable those can be. So I'm going to talk about the current plans to reform the Gender Recognition Act in Scotland, the relationship particularly with the Equality Act, and the attempts to focus some political attention on that. And for reasons of time, I'm going to look at the implications of all this for women in employment, but not because that's the whole sphere of work for women, or the only place this matters, because of course it's not. The peril of coming last is I'm going to repeat some things you've already heard. I've been frantically trying to rejig my speech as I've been listening, so I apologise for some repetition. I won't touch, though, on freedom of speech, but I do want to say, I think the other speakers have mentioned it, and internationally, one of the most rapid and most readily evidenced effects of the introduction of self-declaration in law and in policy has been on women's speech. It's very evident, lots of examples. So just to recap what the reform does, the Scottish Government is proposing to amend the Gender Recognition Act to make it easier for people who live in Scotland or who were born here, wherever they live now, to obtain a gender recognition certificate or GRC. It wants them to be able to do this simply by making what's called the solemn declaration that they intend to live in what the law calls their acquired gender for the rest of their lives, and that they've been doing so for at least 3 months to date, compared to the 2 years required at present. The age limit would fall from 18 to 16, and most significantly, the process becomes completely separated from any sort of medical involvement. So there's no dispute by anybody that this will lead to a much larger number of people having these certificates. The Scottish Government's estimate is there might be 10 times as many, but they admit they don't really know what they're opening the way to here in terms of numbers. The number could be much larger. And there's also no dispute that certificates will be issued much more quickly. So how does this become relevant to rights in the workplace? Well, this comes down to what a GRC does. And the existing Gender Recognition Act says a GRC holder should be treated in law as a woman or a man, depending on what it says on their GRC, with some limited exceptions. And the critical question here then is whether a GRC changes your sex for the purpose of the Equality Act, which is the bit of the law most relevant to protection from sex discrimination in the workplace and more generally, as Anne so eloquently explained just now. So the law is silent on this point, and lawyers disagree about whether the way the Equality Act itself is written means that GRCs are excluded from having any effect on how people are viewed when it comes to sex discrimination. However, the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, so a big player in all this, believes that firmly that GRCs do change a person's sex under the Equality Act. Now, if they are right, then making GRCs more readily and widely available would make tackling sex discrimination in the work will matter in tackling sex discrimination in the workplace and elsewhere. Now, the EHRC has expressed concerns to the Scottish Government about its plans, and that's not least because of the crossover they see with the Equality Act. The one way of looking at this, one good example is pay discrimination. In the words of the EHRC, when a woman claims equal pay, she must compare her pay to a man who she believes is carrying out equal work, but is being paid more for it, known as a comparator. Now, the more easily that colleagues recruited and promoted as men are able to be recategorized as women, the more often women will find their comparator has been removed. And lawyers expert in this area have talked about the ability of a woman to bring an equal pay claim potentially being extinguished, is the word, by a male comparator who acquires a GRC. It's worth being aware, and I think we sort of touched on this already, but I want to actually touch on it a bit more. It's worth being aware that in the UK, the majority of employees are in businesses which have fewer than 50 employees. Now, in many cases, equal pay claims will be based on looking at colleagues in small units in a larger firm in the other cases. So reclassifying one person's sex from male to female could be enough in many situations to obscure a pattern of sex discrimination in pay or promotion. And data, people have touched on data. Data is also more likely to be affected than comparative data in smaller settings and measured in smaller places. And we can take this issue into other workplace settings covered by the Equality Act where sex is relevant, such as access to single-sex facilities, which Pragna talked about very eloquently, and opportunities, further opportunities for women in employment, which Anne touched on. Although GRCs are protected in law as private documents and the law puts in place very strict privacy protections for GRC holders, there's nothing to stop a GRC holder from choosing to use their status in the workplace to assert stronger rights than they believed they had before to being treated in line with their identity. And there's nothing explicit in the face of the statute that offers an uncertain employer anything to fall back on if a GRC holder does this. And Pragna talked about the small providers being frightened of lawsuits, and the same will be true of small employers. It's important to say this isn't entirely a new issue. What's new is the frequency and speed with which GRCs will be available in practice. And the number of GRC holders is currently very small. It's around 600 in Scotland. What will change is the probability of women encountering this situation. Other things that might change, in fact, is also the nature of GRC holding population. I'm quite happy to come back into questions why I think that might matter here too. So it's important to stress at this point that the law here is grey. Not everyone thinks the EHRC is right. Lawyers' views are divided at a senior level. What the limited case law means is contested. But, and this is very important, the Scottish Government deserves some special mention here for riding two horses, depending on what race it thinks it's running. When it talks about its plans to reform the GRA, it says the Equality Act is a separate issue, and it berates the EHRC. It's gone out of its way to do so for raising objections based on the interaction between the two statutes, between the Gender Recognition Act and the Equality Act. But over in the Scottish courts right now, the same Scottish Government is defending a case brought by the fabulous women of For Women Scotland entirely on the basis that a GRC does indeed change your sex under the Equality Act. And it acknowledged, in response to us, to MBM, in a letter that took it 2 years to write, that a GRC might make some difference in contexts covered by the Act, including to employers. And if you think you might be missing something, you must be missing something. And the government here could not be so brazenly attempting such a hypocritical, confused and contradictory line, then I'm afraid the answer is you're not missing anything. That's exactly what the Scottish Government is doing. And my best way of giving that some colour is to say, it's imagine you've got a flatmate, you live with a flatmate, and they tell you they're handing out lots of extra keys to the front door, and you object. And they tell you, don't be so stupid, there's nothing changing. I'm not changing the lock. That is effectively pretty much, as far as we can see, the Scottish Government's logic. Engaging politicians and others then becomes quite an issue and has been a focus of attention up here in Scotland now for a long time. Many women's groups and individual women have tried to get the Scottish Government and MSPs to focus on the importance of understanding and clarifying the relationship between the Gender Recognition Act and the Equality Act. So they started doing this during the very first consultation on GRA reform here in Scotland, so 5 years ago. We, and here I mean Lisa Mackenzie, Kath Murray and myself, who worked together on this, we came into this discussion later in 2019, and we flagged this up very early as one of the things that we were worried about. So what's happened? Well, we and others have raised this issue about the interaction between these two bits of legislation. We've raised it in meetings with civil servants and with ministers, with opposition MSPs, written consultation responses to the government twice and to the parliaments of 3 consultations. We've sent letters, produced briefings for MSPs. We've provided detailed explanations of the issues in writing, directly informed sometimes by legal input. And we've produced pithy short summaries. We've put on briefing meetings with lawyers for MSPs looking precisely at this issue. We've given oral evidence to the Parliament. We've acted as individuals, as separate groups, and as groups working together. Women, working mostly in their unpaid time, cannot stress that enough, have pushed every button that serious, engaged citizens are told that they should press. And they've done so repeatedly. But has it cut through? When proposals to change the law in Scotland are Parliament, the first step is that an existing committee undertakes an initial piece of work that looks into the ideas in the bill, of proposals, and then it writes a report summarising what it makes of the evidence it's gathered. In this case, the job was given to the Equalities, Human Rights and Civil Justice Committee. And that work started when the current bill was introduced in Holyrood in March. And we expect its report, the report of this committee, any day now. And we've been told to expect a debate on that report at the end of the month, 27th of October is the date. Now, I sat in on every oral evidence session the committee held on this bill. And I want to take this opportunity quite particularly to thank 20 or so women who between them made sure that there was always at least one row of women in that room visibly watching and listening to proceedings where committee members could see them. And I'm so glad they did that. Now, there were times in the hearings where the message is that it really matters whether a GRC changes how you're defined under the Equality Act did seem to cut through with some members. But the government has majority here due to the coalition between the SNP and the Greens, majority on the committee as well as in the Parliament. I could say more about the parliamentary process in the questions, but just for time, I won't do that now. If the message about the importance of what a GRC does in the Equality Act, if that message has not cut through, then what we will not accept is it's because it needed making more clearly or more often. The audit trail for the government and the committee, having been told that this issue matters, is exceptionally strong and clear. And to my mind, it will be a serious test of the Scottish Parliament's effectiveness as a scrutiny body, whether it picks up the central importance of the relationship between these two bits of legislation, both now at stage 1 and in the later stages of the bill that are still to come. And if it fails to, and the bill proceeds as currently drafted, the scope for ripple effects that impinge on women's rights in the workplace and other contexts is real. And we will make really sure that not a single person who votes for the bill in that form will be able to say that they were not warned.
Thanks very much, Lucy. I was interested in your final warning there to the MSPs, that you will make sure, and many others will, that they understand just exactly what they're going to vote for in stage 1 and onwards.